Greetings, friends of liberty. Doctor Who was quite insistent that I relinquish possession of the TARDIS this week, claiming for some reason that he needed to be in Cardiff in 1869. Something about a mysterious and troublesome blue vapor animating corpses to life again. And so I'm situated in the smaller library of my North London residence, and given the heat of today, the coolness here amongst the stacks is refreshing. Now, this library behind me has all sorts of works. Here, the Histoire de France avant Clovis, that is, the history of France before Clovis, written by François Mézeray in 1685. But in this video, I want to concentrate not on European history, but to return to the history of your own country, America, and its three greatest institutional crises. At 4:30 in the morning, on April 12, 1861, heralding the beginning of the Civil War, the 47 guns and mortars assembled around Charleston Harbor and encircling Fort Sumter opened fire, its garrison surrendering after a 34-hour bombardment. The subsequent call to arms by both sides, with a flood of men overwhelming recruiting stations both north and south, led to a Union Army at its peak of over 2.6 million men and a Confederate of over 1 million, foretelling the immense human, material, and social devastation the war wrought, with over 1 million total dead and wounded on both sides, and the cities of the South, its railways, property, and economy reduced to ruin. Among the greatest monetary losses to the South was its treasure in the human beings it had once enslaved. This, of course, being the central issue igniting the whole conflict. From the very beginning of the founding in 1776, the institution of slavery, being a contradiction in your national being, had divided the country like no other. The Constitution, in order to fashion a nation, had compromised on its bedrock principle of liberty by allowing the peculiar institution to continue, hoping to resolve the issue in the future by granting the South 3/5 voting rights for every slave held. As the nation grew and incorporated new territory during its expansion, time and time again, compromise with this tyranny was reached. First in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, when Missouri was incorporated as a slave state, Massachusetts removing a chunk of itself as the new state of Maine to create a balancing free state. Secondly, in the Compromise of 1850, when the territory acquired from Mexico during the Mexican War was divided into the Free State of California and the territories Utah and New Mexico, which could choose their status. And finally, as the war approached, more compromise with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed both states into the Union as slave if they wished. The Dred Scott decision of 1857, which explicitly denied blacks their freedom and sovereignty as individuals, and the Fugitive Slave Act, which outraged Northerners in its requirement that they return runaway slaves to their masters. Indeed, the whole conflict itself had been foreshadowed in person when Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate had, after repeated Southern invective, likened pro-slavery Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina to a man choosing an ugly mistress, the mistress of slavery. Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, responded 3 days later to this vivid imagery by arranging to have a friend hold other senators at bay by gunpoint, preventing their interference, and subsequently severely beating Sumner on the floor of the Senate with a cane, resulting in an enormous heightening of national tensions as citizens on both sides identified either with Brooks or Sumner. This war, then, was the first major American institutional crisis, a crisis of liberty, and by necessity resulted in the bloody surgery of the removal of the cancer of slavery. Now to the second crisis. On Black Tuesday, October 24th, 1929, the stock market crashed, the Dow Jones plummeting from 381 to 198, and then after rebounding back to 294, crashing even further to 41 in 1932, a loss of over 90%. As the financial crisis spread throughout much of the developed world, GDP in the U.S. fell by 15%, unemployment reached 23%, and international trade, with the introduction of tariff protection, such as the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill in the U.S. and similar trade barriers in many other countries, collapsed by up to 70%. The Great Depression was also an institutional crisis of America, caused by the bursting of an enormous asset bubble formed during the 20s by the Federal Reserve's inflating of the money supply, that inflating lowering interest rates and thereby creating a large credit boom. Like the Civil War, it was an institutional crisis caused by an intrinsic contradiction built into American society, the Federal Reserve, founded in 1913. No depression in American history ever approached it in severity because the American banking system had never been so controlled by the government, with a control that had horrendous consequences for a generation of Americans in destroying their wealth and standard of living. If we then compare these two greatest American institutional crises, the Civil War and the Great Depression, what do we see? We see that in the case of the Civil War, the cause of the problem and the solution were readily apparent to the nation. Slavery was the problem and the solution its elimination. But with the Great Depression, America never fixed the cause of the problem, the fundamental contradiction, the central bank, represented by the Federal Reserve, which to this day manipulates interest rates, inflates your wealth away, and is, along with a great increase in your national debt caused by governmental deficit spending, an increasing harm which will, at some point, render your nation bankrupt and dollar worthless. And for these reasons, as well as the fact that the world economy uses the dollar as its currency, this will result in another great financial catastrophe, perhaps even greater than the Great Depression. So, America had one catastrophic contradiction in its being slavery, which it fixed, and it has another, Central Reserve banking, which it hasn't. And why did it fix slavery again? Because the cause was obvious. But since the harms of central banking aren't, America hasn't eliminated the cause of the Great Depression. In other words, the lesson of the Great Depression, unlike the experience with slavery, was never learned. Now, the unfortunate reality is that America likely has yet a third major institutional crisis in the making. Yes, a third. The increasing and deteriorating state of your national educational system, from K-12 all the way through college. At every level, teachers, administrators, and those in the Department of Education, and even the President of the United States himself, are using that system to indoctrinate students, your young people, with increasingly false, immoral, and destructive ideas, with the result that when those students graduate and head out into the real world, they bring those harmful ideas to the rest of society and corrupt the institutions which employ them. And though there's a lot of ruin in a nation, if the worst case scenario comes to pass, America will change its fundamental nature as a consequence. And what will the world become if America no longer fights for freedom, for itself and others? So what then is the answer to this growing institutional crisis this third crisis? The answer is understanding. America needs to understand the cause of the problem so that it can know how to fix it, like it did with slavery, but didn't with the Federal Reserve. And America can do that. It can achieve that understanding if it realizes that it has been the governmental influence over American education that has, over time, especially the last century, caused this growing educational crisis. What are the causes of this deterioration in education? The causes are, number one, the tax exemptions for private colleges and the public funding of state colleges, which remove both types of colleges from your direct funding control as paying customers and philanthropic donors, which means that you have little direct influence on how politically correct and woke these institutions become. Number two, the huge amounts of federal monies since World War II given to higher education, either directly or via student loans, which allowed them to create thousands of politically correct departments throughout the country. And three, civil rights legislation, specifically Title 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Act, which forces colleges to act in racist and sexist ways in order to be eligible to accept student loans and aid, without which they would go bankrupt. If we understand how this evil is spreading, as you did with slavery, we can destroy it. But if you do not, as with the Federal Reserve, thus far, we cannot. Your fate is in your hands. On that note, I bid you well, and remain as ever, the Scarlet Pimpernel.